Hello, welcome to Therapy for Nerds. I am your host, Cassidy Russell, along with,
Abbey Ronquillo and
Busse.
and today we are joined by two amazing people. And I'll start off with, how about Ernesto?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I mean, the fact that you guys really branded yourself as therapy for nerds, this is my people. But anyway, my name is Ernesto. I do a few things. I am a psychotherapist. I own a group practice here in Southern California. And I'm usually doing entrepreneurial coaching now. And I'm also on the side, am a videographer. So, and a fellow nerd as well. So thank you again for having me.
Oh, thank you. And last but certainly not least, Debi Frankle. Debi.
I'm so excited to be here. I actually have been referring to myself as a grief nerd for a little while now. Is that I've been in grief for, oh man, oh my gosh, more than a quarter of a century, which makes me feel really, really, really old.
And wise.
Yeah. I've gotten into that like sage part of my life now. And so I actually focus now a lot on teaching clinicians to look for grief, to see grief, because we get all these courses on how to handle, how to recognize and handle anxiety and depression. And it's like, yes, but hello, woo, there's grief that's underneath all of that, especially with trauma. Trauma is knotted with grief. And so that's my passion. I just love that. And so I do a lot of trainings and every time that I get a chance to be able to talk about grief, and especially with WandaVision, this is so cool because there's so many metaphors. But yeah, I just I love talking about grief. So anyway, so thanks for having me.
Thank you. So you mentioned the traumas, which I think is so central to the WandaVision show.
Mm-hmm.
But particularly, I felt the commercials. So maybe we can start off by talking about the commercials that are in WandaVision and how that relates back to Wanda's grief and Wanda's trauma. Maybe even starting with the toaster commercial, which is the first one, the Stark toaster. Who wants to start talking about that one?
That's interesting that you bring that out because when you look from the first to the last episode, the commercials escalated, right? And if you notice, if you look at I know the stages of grief is pretty old and we don't use those models, but if you look at if you look at the actual commercials, there's elements of those stages. So when you look at it from those lenses, it's really giving us it's giving us snapshots of the stages or the categories or the areas of WandaVision's process and trauma. And it is just so interesting, all these metaphors, trying to put in the Marvel universe all together, and at the same time how Wanda is processing her reality, quote unquote reality, and coming to grips. I mean, the last commercial, was like, holy crap, that is her experience. And the toaster was the start of the origins of her trauma, which was Stark Industry. It connected start the bomb or the missile that did not go off, or we think it didn't go off. She may have done something to it, but from the very beginning of my trauma started from this organization that I'm now connected to somehow.
Yeah, and the ambivalence in that. Yeah.
I think the show does a really great job of really illustrating throughout the episodes. Maybe you don't find out what that means until the next episode or a couple of episodes later, but they did a great job of really tying together and showing you and illustrating really what the connections are. So I don't think you find out about the toaster if you're not really into, the Marvel universe. You don't really know what that toaster means or the word Stark or some of these other, brandings until like much later into the episodes. But Ernesto, you did bring up, the idea of the stages of grief. I don't know, maybe even if we don't use them, maybe for our users at home, and maybe even for the people who create the series, maybe they had that in mind of like using the stages of grief. So I'm wondering if you or Debbie maybe together could collaborate and tell our listeners what those stages are and how we process through that.
Debbie is the expert on this. I only talk about the actual brilliance, and after I talk, maybe Debbie, you can chime in on this. But the actual brilliance of the understanding of the internal process that Wanda has gone through, and Hollywood is always behind on the psychological research and process, but overall they get the human condition, they get the traumas that happen throughout life. And so every little thing in that movie, in that show, from the commercials to the kid on the island and all of these other commercials that's out there, it's really pointing to an experience, right? It's giving a foreshadow, and it makes us curious on, is Wanda the villain, or is she the victim? Is she going to, it's just one of those things where questions and questions and questions, right, Debbie?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think it's so interesting, those stages that that we actually who specialize in grief tend not to use. But the first stage is denial, which is really, really strong in this, is no, that didn't happen. And the second stage is anger, and then bargaining, and then depression, and then acceptance. And so I think that whole denial piece of no, this didn't happen, I found really fascinating. Like in episode 1, when we first started. Now, I will also totally admit to all of you nerds is that that I have watched the Marvel movies with Mark, but Mark is like, my husband is he's really funny because we'll watch WandaVision and then he's got to stop and explain the whole thing, and I'm like, yeah. And I'm like, yeah, well, but wait a minute, she's grieving this, da, 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 da. So episode 1, I was like, what? I don't understand. But it was really fascinating with going back to it, of this notion that they had no memory of the past, of what happened, and the getting married. Those grief is so much about all the hopes and dreams and expectations that got completely blown up, and so not knowing, well, wait a minute, what's our anniversary date, right? And so there isn't that, and the expectation, which was interesting, where Agnes had said, well, do you have kids? Wait, you don't have kids yet? So it's that, that expectation of, oh, well, I didn't get to marry him, and we didn't get kids, and we didn't get this whole, future that, in episode 8, we figure out, oh my gosh, the whole thing about Dick Van Dyke. Because I know when I looked at that first episode, I was like so confused. This seems so weird, but then makes so much sense later on, which I think is also fascinating of what we do in therapy, right? Is that we, help people put the story together, and then later on go, oh, well, no wonder, no wonder that you're so, hyper vigilant, or, that, anniversaries before an anniversary, that you get so anxious, because that makes so much sense, tying that together with what happened in the past.
That's very interesting. Yeah, that's what we do in general as clinicians, right? When clients come to us, especially, Debbie, you can correct me if I'm wrong, when clients come to us with a traumatic grief, they're all over the map, and it's our role to somewhat track with them and to hold that piece here, because that information is valuable somewhere in the puzzle, right? And so that makes a lot of sense, where even when you watch the first episode all the way to the end, it's like, what the heck is going on?
Right.
If you're not a Marvel Comics follower, if you don't understand the House of M or even the story of Vision and Wanda,
Mhm.
you know, your head's gonna go all over the place. What is she doing? But for us who have followed the comic books, especially the House of M, we know that it's coming towards a very dark
Mhm.
story with hints of hope in places. But you're absolutely right. It takes us to this question, like, and there's an addiction piece about it too. It's
Mhm.
like, we have to wait until Friday again. Like, what the heck? 20 minutes of this. I mean, you could see Twitter exploding. Like, why is it just 20 minutes? Why this and why that? And I found myself trying to figure out, like, why am I having such reaction to this? And it's just like with our clients, Debbie, right? It's like,
Right.
tell me more of your story so that I can help you. We feel that sense of helplessness.
Yeah. I was also thinking of, I often refer to kind of an imagery of the puzzle, and then when we get another piece, it's like, wait a minute, I thought that I had all the pieces. Now, wait, I gotta like reconfigure all of this. I've been madly like taking notes, knowing that we were going to talk about this. And I was like, oh my gosh, now I'm gonna have to go back and go take notes. But I was thinking about in episode 2, when she gets pregnant and she says, is this really happening? And so, that's that cue, kind of clue of, wait a minute, is this really true or not? And I think grievers also, I know when they come into my office, especially if it's recent, they feel crazy. They say there must be something wrong with me. Everybody else seems to be okay. And the world feels so incredibly surreal. Like everything's completely different and the same all at the same time. And how bizarre and weird. We usually use the word weird a lot when we're talking about grief. Like, wait a minute, it just feels strange. Like this isn't how it was supposed to be.
Yeah, doesn't feel familiar.
Yeah. And how it's supposed to progress is that, wait a minute, we were supposed to get married, we were supposed to have kids.
Just thinking, especially after you see the deed that Vision left for her, and like knowing that turned in, at least my
Yeah.
that turned into the calendar with the heart.
Yes.
That literally almost killed me. That scene almost killed me.
Yeah.
Debbie, the really cool thing about what you just said in episode 2 is, the images of the stork, the images of people correlated to the villain, which is Mephisto. But we learn now that those little Easter egg was, and from my perspective, the stork represents, one of those imagery that a child is going to come, right? Or that's a child. And so if you notice, when she tries to make that stork disappear, it didn't. It reappeared because that's part of her dream. That's part of her longing.
Yeah.
So she couldn't just let it go away.
Yeah.
Right? It was such a brilliant way of saying, no, I've created this child, these kids, but I'm not quite sure. And that stork represents that. We all thought that stork represented the villains in the Marvel universe. Now, we may not know, but it just shows that it didn't respond to her magic because that was really, really deep rooted longing for her.
Yeah. This deep longing, this I say this, and this hope that became, we can say sometimes unrealistic, and yet, it's WandaVision, and so so it's like, so it is all about the fantasy, okay? Because there is all of the fantasy of how it was supposed to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Debbie, I definitely have a question about that then, because as a practitioner going through our training, hope is a big theme that we use not only for grief and loss patients, but for anybody going through therapy.
Oh yeah.
Always having a sense of there's something on the other side of whatever I'm going through right now in this struggle. So for those who are experiencing deep grief or like Wanda, something that they really wanted and something that's unattainable. Is there a such thing as bad hope, or like having too much hope that's unrealistic?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question, Abby. It's interesting because at the end of my first session with somebody who's come in about grief, I always say, you know what, I'm going to hold the hope for you, because you may not have that right now. Often their hopes have been completely smashed, and and in being able to say, you know what, I'm going to hold the hope for you. You don't have to have that. Okay. It's almost a paradox, actually, of saying, come on, things are going to get better, because they don't believe that. It's like, no, everything's been completely destroyed. My world is completely upside down. The rug has been pulled out from underneath me. I have no idea of what's happening, and what's going to happen, and our fear of, oh my gosh, how am I going to get through this? Or how am I going to get my kids through this? And how scary that is. But I think the pain of grief often is being able to help them identify all of those hopes and dreams and expectations that they had, in order for them to be able to, I think, repair them in our work in therapy, of being able to identify the regrets or the guilt that they have, and that's that bittersweet. That's that, am I the villain or am I the victim? And I think that there's both.
Abby, that's a really good question. You can see it in episode 4 when Vision yelled, "Who am I?" Right?
Mm-hmm.
Who am I? Now, when you look at it from a perspective, because Vision is a piece of Wanda,
Mm-hmm.
we don't. I'm not quite sure if that was Vision asking the question or Wanda really trying to figure out who she is at that point. And to answer your question, from is there a hope that is rooted somewhere in something inappropriate, right? That's you can see it in Vision's storyline, because sometimes we hope for something and we lose ourselves, right? We don't know we don't know who we are becoming at that point. So when you look back at WandaVision and just Vision's trying to make sense of everything about who he is and all of that stuff, it's also coming from a place of, this is Wanda's process, because we all know that everyone in that community, including Vision, including the kids, is a replication of Wanda's process. So anytime Vision is saying something, I'm like, I wonder if that's what Wanda is projecting.
Right.
And that hope, right, of that, because in the comic books, Wanda's one of Wanda's powers, and I hope it's going to be revealed in Doctor Strange, is she's a necromancer, a sorcerer, so she can bring people from the dead. And so when you think about it, from a grief perspective, even Monica Rambeau said this: if I had your powers, I would bring my mom back. Right. So really powerful process of this necromancer. They didn't even talk about it in the movie, but you kind of got a glimpse of it when she was fighting what's her name? The other witch. Agatha, when she brought to life the other witches that she killed, right? That was a glimpse of one of Wanda's powers, where she could bring people from the dead. And so, there is that false hope. There's that I don't know if I want to say inappropriate hope, but there's also that spectrum of hope that, yes, we would love to dig up the grave of our loved ones. But is that a hope worth fighting for? And Wanda, with all her powers, could actually do it. And she actually did it.
Yeah, and I wonder with the idea of hope, because I know we're talking about, could there be a hope that comes from a place that maybe doesn't serve us as well, that isn't meeting where we are and what's realistic to our life. And I wonder, could it be an idea of like just redefining the relationship with hope? Because obviously, like we want to be able to have the hope, we want to be able to have that relationship that we've had with those people, but it's about redefining what it looks like right now to still contain that hope in our lives.
Katie, that's a great point, because I really think that, it's grieving the loss of the physical relationship that we've had with our loved ones, and also redefining and being able to look at, well, wait a minute, but we are always going to have an emotional relationship with them. And for some people, we're always going to have a spiritual relationship. But the emotional and the spiritual relationship, we're not as in tune with, or we're not as tethered to them that way. We've been used to being connected, to them in the physical world, but that our loved ones will always be with us. I made a note about in episode 3 where Wanda says, "Wait a minute, there's something wrong here, and we're in uncharted waters." And Geraldine, after the babies are born, and she says he was killed by Ultron, referring to her brother. And then she, I know, talks about, well, I'm a twin. I had a brother named Pietro, and starts singing this lullaby in this native language, and that kind of, that connection. It was interesting. I wasn't surprised that she didn't have just one baby. Of course, she had to have twins. That's her connection with her brother that continues.
Yeah, yeah. I love what you just said as far as a connection, and it goes back, Abby, to your question about hope, and Katie, the relationship with hope as well too, is that physically they don't have to be here, right? We can keep them in our hearts, and I think that's what happened with Wanda, is that she had them in her heart, but her power was so it was anguish. It wasn't it was anguish. And so that anguish is so powerful that whatever was stored here, you can see that in episode 8, I think, yeah, episode 8, when all of the energy came from her heart, right? And it just created vision and created this world. But you're right. I think they're forming the relationship of what that looks like, redefining the relationship with the people around her. And you can see this in the last sad episode where I almost lost it, when she turned to her kids and says, "Thank you for choosing me.
Yeah.
Thank you for choosing me to be your mother," or something like that. I was like, what else, Marvel? What else are you gonna drop on us? What the heck? It was just so powerful. So yeah, she changed her relationship with Vision. She changed her relationship with her kids at that point. And watch out for those two kids. Watch out for those two kids, because they're already setting the stone for the next piece.
Young Avengers, here we go. Let's go.
I can really appreciate what you're all bringing forward to the table, especially what Katie said about reframing, because that is so important to all of our clients and in general, to reframe negative experiences to be this positive thing and empower us to move forward. However, I'm just gonna make it complicated. How about ambiguous grief, when we really don't know exactly what we are expressing or what we're feeling, and it's not as clear cut? This person might not be dead. This person might not be gone. We still might feel this. We might still feel a sense of hope that there is something that we could potentially do, but how it's going to affect us in a negative way, but we still want it. How about those types of relationships?
You know what? I think that, I think we'll talk about complicated grief, because this is so complicated, because it is so complicated. Look at all of the cumulative grief, okay, for Wanda, where, it was her parents, and it was her brother, and then Vision. And all of that, when our clients come to us with one grief, with one recent loss, they also come with all of the losses that they've had. you know, and it all gets mixed in, you know, and to be able to help them sort through that, you know, I think that I like to use the word bittersweet a lot, okay, is that it's this and this, you know, it can be, yes, I'm relieved that they're not suffering anymore, and my heart misses them so much at the same time, you know. And that ambiguous grief is that kind of, well, you know, I have mixed feelings, or I'm not really quite sure, they're not really gone, or are they really gone? Um, you know, especially when they're missing, it's like, wait a minute, are they really missing? Which I think was really interesting in, I think it was episode 8, when she goes and you get the story about her, you know, going in and making, she wants to see Vision's body, you know, that verification, you know, that's not, it's this, it's, I don't like to use the word closure, because the image of closure is like, okay, close the door and we're done. It's like, well, no, then, you know, but there's the emotional relationship and those continuing, what we call continuing bonds. But I think her, you know, her veracity and, no, I have to see him, and no, you know, to, you know, her perception of, oh, well, it's just a bot, you know, bot is just parts, you know, and a thing. But no, he's, you know, he's my husband. I love him, and I need, I need to protect him. I need to make sure that he is honored and buried, or has a funeral, you know. And then when she goes and, this is what actually got, I was, you know, got that lump in my throat of when she goes over to the body and the stone is gone. And she says, can't, I can't feel you. You know, his soul is gone. And that, you know, so many grievers will talk about, I could tell, you know, I was there when the person died, and then all of a sudden I realized, no, wait a minute, this is just a body now. The soul was gone, you know. And then to be able to help grievers reconnect, you know, and kind of reattach more emotionally and spiritually. Yeah.
That makes a lot of that makes a lot of sense, Debbie. And this is why Debbie's the go-to grief expert on this stuff, because you know she formulates this in your mind in a very clinical term. And you know what I gather in this conversation, and also from the House of M and her story in WandaVision, is that a grieving mind can be cruel, you know. And you you can see this in her reaction when Pietro showed up at the door, and then that one time when Agnes was shown to be the puppet master with all of these things. It's like, oh my gosh, I want to punch her in the face for that. You know, it's so cruel, because I know when my mom passed away, I started 2 weeks after I started smelling her perfume. I started somewhat seeing shadows in my house, and there's I heard her voice in the wake and sleep stage, and then my sister had a recording of her voice, and she played it, and I'm like, what the heck? So you can't even imagine with what Wanda went through on seeing visually, hearing, touching, feeling, smelling, and what her brain must have been, Debbie, you think, very overwhelmed with something like this, you know? Very cruel.
Yeah. That's very interesting you say it, because I talk to grievers about, and when I'm doing trainings, I talk about, look, there's this hypersensitivity for a griever of what and who they're missing. And so they will, it's like they have radar, you know, and so, you know, they're in a crowd and see well, there's not a whole lot of crowds these last year, but but to be out and see the back of somebody's head and it
Right.
looks like, wait a minute, that looks like that, my dad or my mom or whoever's not there, and we're hypersensitive to that, with all of our senses.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was,
Anytime we saw yellow flowers, yellow roses,
right.
because that was
It had,
my mom's favorite colors, and you know, I mean, it was just so. You're right. We were so hyper vigilant with those things, and
and
you
they had
know,
a different meaning. Yeah.
valuable meanings, and
Yeah.
as evidenced by Wanda's house, all the images that was in there
Yeah.
had meaning, from
Mhm.
Stark Industry to her home in Scovia, no,
Sokovia.
Sokovia.
Mhm.
Yeah, all of these places, even her accent, when she was going in and out of her accent,
Mhm.
it was like, who am I? What do I do?
Mhm.
um and you can even hear when Agnes was trying to taunt her with,
Mhm.
it's interesting that your accent is going away, or your brother's body is full of holes. I'm like,
Mhm.
what the how can you drive the knife further into this woman's soul? It's like, oh, I just use this one guy named Ralph to maybe make it look like he's your brother, but your brother is full of holes somewhere else. And it's like, what the heck?
It's really funny because for a little bit in that scene, it almost felt um like a therapy session where the griever doesn't want to see that kind of, oh, I don't want to deal with this. Sometimes my clients will be really honest and say, I really didn't want to come today. It's like,
Yeah.
well, of course you're not in the mood to do this shit. This hurts, and it's just,
Yeah.
and I tell them, when I have to do this work, I say the F word a lot because it's painful to confront that reality.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
Yeah.
as she goes along, at first the deeper, or the earlier memories, it seems like she's very like, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this. And then
Mhm.
there's like a turning point where she's kind of like, wait, I remember this, I want to
Mhm.
do this. And she walks towards the door.
Yeah, and
She's
it
very,
makes more sense. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
she's very curious about it too. And
Yeah.
I go back to Agnes, her character as taunting, right? As chastising, like, oh, this is a sweet moment, and she does a tear,
Mhm.
and just pushes her, like, it's almost as if she, of course, she wanted to know who Wanda was at that time, right? She didn't know she was a Scarlet Witch,
Mhm.
but she was really trying to get to, let's get deeper and deeper. How are you allowing all of these spells to happen at one time without you not even knowing it?